So unfortunately, you don't have to look very far these days to find the impacts of global climate change. The number, the impact of disasters, natural disasters occurring around the world is growing, and the Camp Fire recently, the tragic events there show us the importance for looking at resilience from a large-scale community effort. So while we're talking today about airports and sea level rise, the concepts we're going to discuss should be applicable regardless of industry, risk, or location. So we're hoping that our examples and discussion will spur some action, and we're hoping to see a good number of you at lunch at our table this afternoon, whether you want to have some additional questions and comments or you're looking for an action partner to implement some resilient thoughts. And so we know that resiliency is only going to be increasingly important in society for businesses and for city planners alike. So I'd like to encourage everyone, if you look at the slides, there's 4 of these. These are top 4 recommendations from the Australian Business Roundtable for disaster resilience and safer cities. They've been in existence for about 5 years. They've put out as many as 5 reports. It's a partnership between industry and the Australian Red Cross. Deloitte is proud to be assisting them in their efforts. There's a whole host of resources looking at a number of aspects of resilience. And I would encourage everyone who's interested to review and leverage the work that they've done. So with that, we'll start with Josh. So the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has a rather large portfolio. You've got 6 airports, including LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. You've got multiple transit agencies. You've got 6 major bridges and tunnels, real estate developments and portfolios. You have no tax authority or tax revenue. So how do you plan for and prioritize your resilient efforts across that portfolio?
You make it sound very challenging, certainly. And Colin, I was going to say that I didn't notice until we were seated here that you were also wearing whimsical socks.
There we go.
Welcome to the whimsical sock club. So the Port Authority's revenue situation, it's just useful, I think, to provide a bit of context. Port Authority is a self-funding agency. We actually, as you mentioned, have no taxing authority. That's been the way it was established in 1921. We are funded by user fees, so that means tax and toll revenue, or toll revenue from our Trans-Hudson crossings. That includes George Washington Bridge, Holland Tunnel, Lincoln Tunnel. And at the airports, a lot of it's lease revenue. We're a landlord airport authority, we're a landlord port. So in a way, that's a benefit for us. We're not tied to the strictures of tax revenue. We do, in fact, actually leverage some tax revenue through agencies like FEMA and FTA for our Sandy recovery program, but the organization is designed to be independent of tax revenue. We, in fact, pay taxes to our local jurisdictions through pilot or payment in lieu of taxes. The way we address resilience at the agency, so I think it's useful to talk about the policy foundation that we have, because that's incredibly important to my work. I couldn't do half of what I do without the support of our executive management and our board of commissioners. Since 2008, we've had a policy actually primarily focused on greenhouse gas mitigation. We have a goal of 80% reduction by 2050 on a baseline of 2006. That policy was actually just reaffirmed and renewed by our Board of Commissioners last month to achieve full alignment with the Paris Climate Accord. But the policy also requires that we mitigate the risks of climate change to our facility in a way that is as environmentally beneficial as possible, and in a way that hopefully also provides benefits to our host jurisdictions and surrounding communities. I'm in the Port Authority's engineering department. That's where the position's embedded, so I report to the chief engineer. So it won't be surprising that the way that our group fulfills the policy mandate is through design guidelines and the enforcement of those design guidelines. So since 2015, we have had design guidelines for climate resilience. I'm not going to get into the sort of technical basis of those guidelines. You can Google them. They're public guidelines. And for that matter, if you want to sit at our table during lunch, I'd be glad to crunch through them. It's one of my favorite things to do as a technocrat. But effectively, what these guidelines do is they sit on top of local codes and national standards. And they add basically an adjustment factor for projected climate change to ensure that we are getting the expected service life we need out of our assets, to ensure that we're making cost-effective investments today that will fulfill our investment objectives and fulfill the needs of our customers and the private sector community well into the future. This is ongoing work. I think it was actually the mayor this morning who said it's a circle. So this is, our capital plan cycles are 10 years. I see this work as perpetual work. It will never be finished. But I think we'll get closer and closer with each capital plan cycle to meeting the objective of effectively and cost-effectively managing our climate change-related risks.
So what's the size of your capital improvement plan?
It's $32.2 billion over 10 years, so it's a big capital plan. That doesn't actually include about at least $10 billion in private sector, public-private partnerships. One of the slides we have circling right now is our LaGuardia redevelopment, Terminal B redevelopment. That's almost all private capital with about $600 million from the Port Authority for infrastructure improvements that our private sector partners are actually implementing based on our guidelines. So the guidelines for climate resilience as well as for sustainable buildings and sustainable infrastructure are actually integrated into the requirements and provisions of work for our private sector partners.
So Aaron, so SFO is a wholly owned entity by the city and county of San Francisco. You're an independent organization. You don't have this massive portfolio for connection, yet you find the airport is within the jurisdiction of another county and surrounded by multiple other organizations. So how do you, in your planning effort, think about coordinating amongst those various stakeholders?
Yeah, thanks for giving some light to the layers of complexity that we're working in, especially following the diversity of assets that are owned by the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. We're not usually looked at as a small entity, but I think relative to scale, and apparently my haircut is not helping my microphone. We certainly have a lot of assets. So we're about a 5,000-acre campus. 13 million square feet of facilities. We generate about $8.5 billion of economic activity for the region. So we recognize the seriousness of protecting that asset and doing so not just for the passengers that are coming to take a once-in-a-lifetime journey or a business traveler, but for the 43,000 people that work at the airport on their journey to a better quality of life. So safeguarding this resource and this asset for us didn't just start. We've been engaged in a shoreline protection program for actually over 40 years. So starting in the early 80s, our incredible engineering and planning and environmental affairs team worked to basically identify deficiencies in our in our shoreline. We have 8 miles of shoreline at the airport, and work to basically ready and build a more robustness in a seawall infrastructure, using things like earthen berms and other materials essentially to ensure that we were protecting our facility. What we recognize more recently, the FEMA flood map has been rotating through, is that there are deficiencies in our seawall. It was located in a variety of different locations across the airport, but not contiguous and continuous. And so we initiated a shoreline protection feasibility study a few years ago to identify where those deficiencies were and realized they were quite significant in order to be able to meet the FEMA flood risk that was recently noticed to the airport. And so what we worked to do over the course of the next few years was basically develop our first shoreline protection program. That shoreline protection program will basically be a patchwork of innovation that helps us build out movable barriers, riprap to mitigate and minimize wave run-up, and a variety of different infrastructure investments for the airport that's about to initiate and move into environmental review. We expect that to happen next year. And then essentially over the course of the next decade, we'll be deploying that through a large capital program. We think that that will help us not only make sure that we can address our flood risk, but that we can be much more resilient to the climate future that is expected for our airport and for our assets. And naturally, we recognize that we can't do that independently. So on your question of partnership, our airport has been very actively and intimately involved with a variety of different initiatives that are happening across the Bay Area. Many of you here are probably aware, tracking and or maybe in many cases leading that work. Our airport has done that through, number one, kind of partnership collaboration, but also grant making. So obviously relative to getting permits, we've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers. relative to asset owners within the airport's campus. The coastline actually owns a portion of our shoreline, so working actively with the Coast Guard.
This is going to make you sound better.
Okay, I just keep
Yeah,
clicking.
yeah, it's okay.
I shouldn't have gotten that haircut yesterday. Also, which I never get my haircut, but it's, mom of two, just never have time for that. But we also have been working, the city and county of San Francisco has really taken a great lead in developing a sea level rise working group. Our city and the county of San Mateo also has a technical advisory committee that we're part of. We have a grant through the Coastal Conservancy and have been working wherever possible with the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and honestly dozens more. We recognize the interconnectedness in our shoreline, but also that there are deficits and gaps that we need to work with our adjacent communities on the 101 border side of our airport. And so as that work is activating, particularly in San Mateo County, with general plan amendments and future work that we expect to move forward with them in the relative short order, we'll make sure that we're very actively engaged. We see that as being absolutely essential to making sure that happens, but also recognize a great benefit in working with those entities, particularly for advanced mitigation, given that we're a very land-constrained facility. We're not just working on innovation from infrastructure perspective, but also are looking to do an in-lieu fee banking program that can develop a natural system approach to the shoreline restoration that's proposed for the airport that will require a variety of different stakeholders and also hopefully give advantage to them where they too are landlocked or land constrained.
So 40 years plus another decade, we've got a $32 billion capital improvement plan. And that's just, so your time, your 50-year horizon is for shoreline protection. So we recognize from that the costs are considerable, the time is considerable, and we know that resiliency is more than just flooding on tarmacs. I mean, you've got a great image here showing that most of your airport is under the 100-year floodplain. So what other issues are you thinking about from a resiliency perspective, and how are you planning and implementing those efforts across the SFO?
So fostering and building the campus of the future that we know needs to be climate ready, we're working on, I would say, kind of two components or scopes of work. The first is advanced study, and then the second is much more on infrastructure resilience. So in terms of advanced and broadening study for the airport to build our awareness and knowledge base of what the future will look like for our campus, we're not just working with those stakeholders I mentioned earlier, but also working to build a next generation of emergency preparedness professionals. So we've worked through our emergency preparedness team to also partner with the city and county who's doing a climate hazard risk assessment right now, and also separately a lifelines inventory to understand what essentially are the viable networks that serve our city, so telecom, utility assets, food networks, and how do we make sure that those also can address and abate the impacts of climate change to ensure the fortitude and strength of that community for decades and generations to come. In addition to that, we're also working with, within the emergency preparedness mindset, taking what we learned from that lifelines analysis and then building that back into scenario planning and climate readiness for our critical asset and facility should a climate event happen, and we need to really activate our facility and campus. Beyond that, also, we're working with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, the Port of San Francisco, and the Public Utilities Commission to basically supercompute climate impacts for the airport to do scenario planning on the coalescence of impacts, so including sea level rise, storm surge, extreme precipitation at a microgranular level, so we can understand at a minimum within a 1-mile radius what this actually means for San Francisco as opposed to the larger scale magnitude studies that have been prepared in the past, and then basically take that and fold that into infrastructure planning. So on a smaller scale than $32 billion plus other private investments, our airport is activating a $7.4 billion capital plan to basically work across the variety of assets that we have on our campus, and we are doing everything that we can to make sure that that campus can operate as independent and robustly as possible, given again, future climate realities. And so we are activating a variety of different projects that are focused on distributed energy resources, EV charging and banking, an advanced water treatment facility, renewables plus storage. All of these things are projects that we think that should the PUC or PG&E utilities that are serving our airport currently go down, it'll allow the airport to basically microgrid and operate and function where we need to. And so those are all under the context of not only activating the campus to have those larger assets involved, but also make sure that we're really reducing the amount of energy load that we have on our campus through advanced energy efficiency measures, retro-commissioning. I mentioned microgrids earlier, and also wherever viable, using biodiversity, green infrastructure, and then energy use intensity targets that are contractual obligations for those projects that are coming online.
So energy, utilities, water, seawall, flooding, these are a lot of infrastructure pieces that we need to think about. And so with that, so let's go back to the Port of New York and New Jersey and New York. If you think about where you build that, right? If you think about FEMA flood maps and the flooding that you've experienced there's been a lot of conversations. There was some discussion in the last panel about changing the flood maps. Which map do you use? We know that there's a potentially controversial public input phase to the FEMA flood map development. So what's your take on FEMA flood maps? How do you use them, and how do you think about where do you stage and install your infrastructure?
Well, is this on?
You needed to get a beard cut.
There we go. Yeah. I did just get a beard cut. This is my short beard. Anyone from FEMA in the room? Because I'm actually going to say something good about the FEMA flood maps. We use them, and they're imperfect tools. Nonetheless, we use them. The most practical reason why we use them is because they're actually mandated by building codes both in New York and New Jersey. So they're incorporated by reference. There's no way around it. And like I said, our design guidelines for climate resilience sit on top of all applicable local codes and national standards. But the FEMA maps they cover our entire jurisdiction, which is relatively large and covers a variety of types of infrastructure and assets. They're spatial, which is very useful. They're probabilistic, so they distinguish, depending on the transect you look at, between the 10 and the 100 and the 500 year, which of course we all know are just shorthand for annual exceedance probabilities of 10%, 1%, and 0.2%. So they're useful in understanding the risk picture, the risk equation for our facilities. Like I said, they're imperfect. We have quibbled with the maps. We've actually successfully challenged several panels on technical grounds, either through the amendment process, which is part of the public review phase of any preliminary flood insurance rate map adoption process, or through the letter of map revision process as well. But nonetheless, they provide a useful basis that we can then adopt as a floor, as the absolute minimum. And then at our discretion, and oftentimes we do, perform additional modeling work. We determine that the maps inadequately express risk, especially over the lifespan of very long-lived assets, and we build to a higher standard. What I will say positively as well about FEMA is that FEMA Region 2, which is the group that covers New York, New Jersey, and paradoxically Puerto Rico as well, they are embarking on a restudy process for the preliminary flood insurance rate maps which were initially developed and issued in 2015. Those maps were found to be inadequate. They will never be adopted. We actually use them and the effective flood insurance rate maps, and that's what's required by building code. So nothing is simple in this world. But they have brought us, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the City of New York, the states of New York and New Jersey, and several other regional stakeholders into the mix as a technical advisory council to ensure that we believe that the restudy is proceeding on a solid technical basis, and also to provide them with information about our facilities, coastal protection structures, finer resolution topographical maps. So I think they learned their lesson, and this time around they're proceeding in a very robust and a very collaborative way. So I have only good things to say about FEMA today.
So you talk about probabilities in flood maps, and I think that sort of raises the next issue, the challenge of how do you justify the benefit tomorrow of the avoided disaster, right? Because you can talk about the probability of something happening, but it's very difficult to quantify a future impact for a disaster that hasn't occurred yet. So how do you sell the double dividend of avoided disaster in the future plus the current economic stimulus from a development project today? How do you work that?
Yeah, the answer to that is that we have a crack economics team. The Port Authority is a very large organization, 8,000 souls, all trying to make sure that the region's, economy and mobility keep clicking. And the engineering department, which promulgates this technical standard that I mentioned, that technical standard very prudently has a benefit cost analysis process built into it. Any intervention that we introduce that's specifically oriented to protect us from a climate-oriented risk can be subjected to a climate risk enhanced benefit cost analysis process. And we could not do that in an effective way, in a robust way, without the assistance of our economics group. The two things that we really struggle with when it comes to benefit cost analysis, but we're getting closer on, are the discount rate, of course. So you spend money today and you expect to accrue benefits in the future. The benefits are really avoided losses, avoided failures. And you would expect that, for example, in the case of coastal flood risk, with rising seas, those failure incidents will increase as the future progresses without intervention specifically designed to mitigate it. So spending money today to mitigate a risk in 2050, effectively, the dollars that you spend today are valued as 2018 dollars. The dollars that you recoup in the future might be 2050 or 2060 or 2070 dollars. They tend to get drowned out by the discount rate. So we're working with them on concepts like diminishing discount rates, extremely low discount rates. All this obviously needs to be justifiable and credible in order to get the buy-in from the folks who are actually releasing money to the organizations for these projects, but we're getting there. The other thing is the loss due to actual infrastructure damage is a pretty negligible part of the equation if you think about it. Obviously, we're insured, we're self-insured, and we're insured through very large underwriting entities. I think we have 42 insurers that deal with property risk across the agency. And then, of course, you have federal programs that are meant to help make agencies whole in the case of infrastructure loss. It's really the business impacts and then the broader regional economic impacts, sometimes national or international impacts, that are an important part of the equation. Business losses you can kind of get a handle on by talking to our various transportation line businesses. Those regional economic impacts to commuters, to businesses, to those who do business in the greater New York region, those are much trickier to get a handle on without the assistance of professional economists. So we work with them in order to properly characterize and quantify broader losses in that benefit cost analysis process.
So real quickly, Aaron, we're talking about the economics, the dollars, the broader impact, right? So SFO, $63 billion input to the local economy, direct, indirect, and spin-off activities, supporting 300,000 jobs. Are you thinking about this future of the impact of SFO and what happens if you don't get it right and your part in the local economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a driver to us. Can everyone hear me? Okay. That's the main driver to both our mitigation work as well as our adaptation and resilience work. So I didn't get to mention that we've been basically doing greenhouse gas emissions inventories for a decade and have been recognized by the Airport Council International as a level 3 optimizing airport. We're one of very few in North America that's been able to achieve that level for most recently a 33% emissions reduction off of a 1990 baseline, and also a goal and a motivation to achieving 000 by 2021, so zero net energy carbon neutrality and zero waste. That's our commitment in addition to our shoreline protection program and the resilience and the infrastructure that we're building to ensure that we can continue to offer a high quality experience to the passengers that are coming to the airport and also a high quality job to those 43,000 people that I mentioned earlier. The San Francisco Bay Area, San Francisco in particular, is the 5th most visited city in the US. And SFO is basically we provide 87% of all flights from an international carrier perspective to the Bay Area. So we really are the gateway for how people enter the U.S. from an international perspective. We continue to grow. We are experiencing about 9% growth per year in international traffic over the last 10 years. And so we know that we really are the nexus to continuing to provide for a vibrant and thriving economy within the Bay Area. And we're committed to seeing that through the assets and infrastructure work that I mentioned earlier.
Great. Look forward to seeing folks at lunch. Hopefully you got some information here, and we're looking forward to helping you craft some action items for when you leave and return. Thank you very much.